A black doctor was humiliated and forced out of her first-class seat mid-flight. Minutes later, the flight attendant who made the decision faced consequences no one saw coming. What happened next left the entire airline stunned. Before we start the story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today, and if you enjoy stories like this, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more. Dr. Olivia Grant walked confidently onto the plane, her sharp yet calm presence drawing a few glances. She was dressed in a tailored navy suit, her matching carry-on rolling neatly behind her. Olivia was used to being in spaces where her accomplishments often went unnoticed until she spoke. But today she hoped for a quiet, uneventful flight. She had a keynote speech to deliver the following morning at a prestigious medical conference, and her mind was focused on reviewing her notes. As she made her way to her assigned seat in the first-class cabin, Olivia nodded politely to the flight attendants stationed at the entrance. She found her seat near the window, placed her bag in the overhead compartment, and settled in. She pulled out her tablet and a leather notebook, her usual tools for preparing before a big presentation. Around her, other first-class passengers were busy with their routines, some checking their phones, others sipping complimentary drinks. Olivia remained engrossed in her notes, her pen moving fluidly across the paper. Sophia Blake, one of the flight attendants, entered the first-class section with her usual air of authority. Her crisp uniform and efficient demeanor often set the tone for the cabin, but her eyes stopped when they landed on Olivia. Sophia didn't immediately say anything, but her gaze lingered just a second too long before she moved on, attending to another passenger's request. Olivia, focused on her work, didn't notice. Minutes later, as the cabin filled with the soft hum of boarding announcements, Sophia returned to Olivia's row. "Excuse me," she said in a tone that was polite but carried an edge. "May I see your boarding pass?" Olivia looked up, slightly surprised but unfazed. "Of course," she replied calmly, handing over the neatly folded ticket. Sophia scanned the pass, her expression tightening. "This is for first class?" she asked, her voice carrying a faint note of disbelief. "Yes, that's correct," Olivia said with a small smile, her tone steady. Sophia hesitated for a moment before handing the ticket back. "All right," she said, though her tone suggested the matter wasn't settled in her mind. She walked away briskly, her face slightly flushed. Olivia shook her head and returned to her notes, thinking it was just a routine check. But it wasn't over. From the corner of her eye, Olivia noticed Sophia speaking quietly with another flight attendant near the galley. Both glanced in her direction, their hushed conversation marked with concerned expressions. Olivia stayed composed, but a flicker of unease stirred in her chest. This wasn't the first time she had been scrutinized in spaces where she clearly belonged, and she had learned to navigate such moments with patience. A few minutes later, Sophia returned, this time with a firmer stance and an air of authority. "Dr. Grant," she began, glancing at the tablet and notebook in Olivia's lap as if trying to confirm her name. "I need to speak with you privately." Olivia raised an eyebrow, puzzled by the sudden formality. She placed her belongings aside, stood up, and followed Sophia toward the galley. The first-class cabin grew quieter as passengers exchanged curious glances. Olivia could feel the weight of their stares but held her composure, her head held high. When they reached the galley, Sophia folded her arms and looked directly at Olivia. "It seems there's been an error with your booking," she said. "I'm afraid I'll have to ask you to move to the main cabin." For a moment, Olivia didn't respond. The words hung in the air, and she studied Sophia's face, searching for any sign that this was a misunderstanding. "I don't believe there's been an error," she said evenly. "My ticket was purchased weeks ago and confirmed. Could you check again?" "I've already checked," Sophia said, her voice growing colder. "This seat doesn't seem appropriate for you." The subtle implication in Sophia's words was clear, and Olivia felt a wave of frustration rise. But instead of reacting, she paused, letting the silence do the work. "I'm not sure what you mean by appropriate," Olivia said carefully, "but I assure you my ticket is valid." Sophia stiffened, glancing toward the cockpit door as if to seek silent validation. I don't have time to argue about this. Either you move, or I'll have to involve security." The conversation had shifted from confusing to outright hostile, and Olivia's patience wore thin. Yet she remained composed. "If that's your decision," she said quietly, "then I'll comply for now." She turned and walked back to her seat to retrieve her belongings, aware of the growing murmurs around her. As she made her way to the cramped seat in the economy cabin, escorted by Sophia, Olivia's calm exterior masked a storm brewing within. She wasn't one to let situations like this go unchecked, and she had no intention of starting now. The atmosphere in the economy cabin was starkly different from the quiet sophistication of first class. Olivia found herself wedged between two other passengers in a middle seat. The lack of space, combined with the injustice she had just endured, only deepened her resolve. She carefully stowed her bag beneath the seat and adjusted her posture to maintain her composure. Around her, passengers whispered quietly, some casting sympathetic glances in her direction, while others avoided her gaze altogether. She retrieved her phone and opened her contacts, scrolling until she found a familiar name. Without hesitation, she tapped the number and brought the phone to her ear. "Hi, it's Olivia," she said softly, keeping her voice low to avoid drawing attention. "I need a favor. Something happened on this flight, and I'd like it addressed immediately. Yes, I'll send the details shortly. No need to escalate yet, just stay on standby." She ended the call as swiftly as it began, her expression calm but purposeful. Back in the first-class section, Sophia moved through the cabin with an air of satisfaction, handing out drinks and checking on passengers. She smiled warmly at others, but her mind was preoccupied with Olivia's removal. To her, it felt like a necessary step to maintain the integrity of the first-class experience, though she couldn't articulate why Olivia's presence had unsettled her so much. Sophia's confidence, however, began to waver as she noticed the subtle glances from other crew members. Dennis, the senior flight attendant, watched her with a mixture of curiosity and concern. He had been with the airline long enough to sense when something wasn't right. As Sophia approached Dennis in the galley, he spoke before she could. "What's going on with the woman you moved?" he asked, his tone direct but calm. Sophia shrugged, avoiding his gaze. "There was a mix-up with her ticket. I handled it." Dennis raised an eyebrow. "Handled it? Are you sure about that? First-class passengers don't usually take kindly to being moved, and neither does the airline." Sophia bristled at his remark. "It's fine," she said quickly. "I followed protocol." Dennis didn't push further, but his expression made it clear he wasn't convinced. As he returned to his duties, Sophia felt a flicker of doubt creep in. She dismissed it quickly, reassuring herself that she had done the right thing. Yet, the unease lingered. Meanwhile, Olivia typed a quick text on her phone and hit send. The message was short but direct, containing only one line. "Monitor for now. I'll signal when needed." She slipped the phone back into her bag and leaned back in her seat, her fingers tapping lightly on the armrest. She wasn't angry, she rarely allowed herself to be. Instead, she was calculating her next move. The flight attendants in the economy cabin moved about, offering snacks and drinks. Lila Reed, one of the newer attendants, approached Olivia cautiously, holding a small bottle of water. "Ma'am, is everything all right?" she asked, her voice kind and genuine. Olivia looked up, her calm smile returning. "Thank you, I'm fine," she said, taking the water. "Just a little mix-up, I suppose." Lila hesitated, sensing there was more to the story, but Olivia's composed demeanor discouraged further questioning. "Well, if you need anything, please let me know," Lila offered before moving on. Olivia's thoughts remained focused. She wasn't one to act impulsively, and she knew that timing was everything. For now, she would wait. The pieces were already in motion, and soon the ripple effects of Sophia's actions would begin to unfold. As the plane cruised at 30,000 feet, the hum of the engines filled the cabin. Olivia sat quietly in her cramped seat, her posture calm but her mind working methodically. She occasionally glanced out the window, her reflection in the glass a reminder of the dignity she refused to lose. Her phone buzzed discreetly in her lap, and she glanced down to read the message. Acknowledged. Standing by for further instructions. She placed the phone back into her bag and allowed herself a small, knowing smile. She wasn't someone who sought confrontation, but when faced with blatant disrespect, she knew how to respond with precision. Every action she took now was deliberate, designed not to escalate the situation but to ensure accountability. Back in the first-class section, Sophia was beginning to feel the first cracks in her confidence. The passengers, usually absorbed in their own routines, seemed more watchful than usual. Whispers filled the air, and though no one openly confronted her, Sophia felt the weight of their judgment. Even Dennis, the senior attendant, was casting occasional glances her way, his disapproval thinly veiled. Dennis finally approached her near the galley, his tone sharper this time. "Sophia, are you absolutely sure there wasn't a mistake with that passenger?" he asked, gesturing subtly toward the economy cabin. "Something feels off about this." Sophia stiffened, her jaw tightening. "I've already checked everything," she replied defensively. "She didn't belong in first class." Dennis frowned, leaning closer so their conversation wouldn't carry. "And what exactly made you think that? Was it her ticket, her behavior, or something else?" Sophia opened her mouth to respond, but the words didn't come. For the first time, she realized she couldn't pinpoint a legitimate reason. Her assumption had felt so natural at the moment, but now, under Dennis's scrutiny, it began to unravel. "I had a feeling," she said weakly, avoiding his gaze. Dennis sighed, his expression darkening. "You'd better hope your feeling doesn't blow back on you. First-class passengers aren't just customers, they're connections. You mess with the wrong person and it's your career on the line." Sophia's stomach twisted at his words, but she quickly brushed them aside. She was confident she had handled the situation correctly. Still, a part of her couldn't shake the growing unease. Meanwhile, Olivia observed the flight attendants in the economy cabin. One of them, Lila, moved with genuine kindness, checking on passengers with a warm smile. Olivia appreciated Lila's effort, even in a situation that wasn't her fault. At that moment, the intercom crackled, and the captain's voice came through, calm and professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We'd like to thank you for flying with us today. If there's anything you need, don't hesitate to let our crew know." Olivia glanced toward the front of the plane, her gaze steady. She could sense the subtle shift in the cabin's energy, the way certain passengers seemed more alert than before. The storm was building, and she knew it wouldn't be long before it reached its peak. For now, though, she remained still, letting the situation unfold naturally. Every step had its time, and Olivia had learned the value of patience. The minutes ticked by, each one dragging longer than the last for Sophia. She moved through the first-class cabin mechanically, her usual confidence replaced by a nagging sense of uncertainty. Dennis's words echoed in her mind, but she tried to push them aside. Still, every glance from the passengers, every whispered conversation, felt like a silent judgment, and it was beginning to wear on her. Back in the economy section, Olivia remained composed, her calm demeanor unshaken by the crowded space or the stares she occasionally received. She opened her notebook and began jotting down notes, her handwriting meticulous. To an observer, it might have looked like she was simply brainstorming for her upcoming conference, but Olivia's thoughts were focused elsewhere. She wrote not just to process the events of the day, but to plan her next move with care. Lila returned, her face filled with concern. "Ma'am, would you like another drink, or perhaps a snack?" she asked softly, her kindness evident. Olivia smiled warmly, appreciating the effort. "Just water, please," she replied. "And thank you." Lila nodded and left, but Olivia could see the worry lingering in her expression. It was clear that not everyone on this flight shared Sophia's biases, and Olivia made a mental note to acknowledge Lila's professionalism later. Small gestures of kindness like hers often went unnoticed, but Olivia believed in rewarding those who acted with integrity. The faint chime of the galley phone interrupted Sophia's thoughts. She hesitated before answering, her heart pounding as she lifted the receiver. "This is Sophia," she said, trying to sound composed. The voice on the other end was firm but calm. "This is the captain. We've received a call from the airline's executive office. They're requesting clarification regarding a complaint from a passenger in first class." Sophia's grip on the phone tightened. "A complaint?" she repeated, her voice faltering slightly. "Yes," the captain replied. "The passenger, Dr. Olivia Grant, has alleged she was unfairly removed from her seat. They've requested that you provide a full explanation of your actions upon landing. Until then, you're to avoid any further disruption and ensure all passengers are treated respectfully." Sophia's face went pale and her stomach churned. "Yes, Captain," she managed to say before hanging up. Her hands trembled as she placed the phone back on the hook. For the first time, she realized she might have made a mistake, a costly one. Dennis, standing nearby, noticed her reaction. "What's wrong?" he asked, his tone neutral but probing. Sophia shook her head quickly. "Nothing. It's fine," she said, though her voice betrayed her unease. She turned away, busying herself with tasks to avoid further conversation. Meanwhile, Olivia sat quietly in her seat, her eyes focused on the notebook in her lap. She was aware of the small shifts happening around her, the glances from the crew, the occasional murmurs among the passengers. She glanced at her watch and then at the flight attendants moving through the aisle. It was almost time. She picked up her phone, typing a brief message before slipping it back into her bag. Her expression remained calm, but her eyes carried a sharp focus that hinted at the storm she was about to unleash. Sophia tried to maintain her usual composure, but the weight of the captain's words lingered heavily in her mind. Every action she took now felt like it was being scrutinized, not just by Dennis but by the passengers as well. The first-class cabin had grown unusually quiet, and the whispers among the travelers seemed to grow louder in her head. Dennis, observant as ever, approached her again in the galley. This time, his tone was less questioning and more direct. "Sophia, what's really going on? You've been on edge since that call. Did something happen with the passenger you moved?" Sophia clenched her jaw, trying to steady her voice. "It's under control, Dennis," she said, though her words sounded less convincing than she intended. "The captain just wants me to provide a report after we land." Dennis's brow furrowed. "A report? That doesn't sound like nothing. You know how seriously the airline takes these kinds of complaints, right? Especially when it comes to discrimination." Sophia's heart skipped a beat at the word. Discrimination. She bristled at the suggestion, but a small voice in the back of her mind forced her to confront the possibility. Had her actions been rooted in bias? She had convinced herself earlier that she was following protocol, but now, faced with Dennis's pointed questions, her confidence began to crumble. In the economy cabin, Olivia sat silently, her outward calm masking the methodical thought process at play. She had learned long ago that the most effective way to handle situations like these was to act decisively, but never impulsively. Her phone vibrated again, and she glanced down at the screen. This time, the message was succinct. Confirmed. Full attention secured. She slid the phone back into her bag, her expression unreadable. She could feel the tension around her growing, but she didn't need to look around to know the situation was shifting. Olivia's resolve only strengthened. This wasn't just about her. It was about setting a precedent, ensuring that no one else would face the same treatment she had endured. Meanwhile, back in first class, Sophia's nerves were unraveling. Her movements became more rigid, her smile forced and brittle as she attended to the passengers. Her unease didn't go unnoticed. One of the passengers, a sharply dressed businessman, finally spoke up. "Excuse me," he said, his voice cutting through the quiet. "Wasn't there a woman seated here earlier? I saw her being moved. What was that about?" Sophia froze, the question catching her off guard. "There was a mix-up with her ticket," she replied, her tone defensive. The businessman didn't look convinced. "A mix-up?" he repeated. "She seemed to have a valid ticket when she boarded. That didn't look like a mix-up to me." Sophia opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. She felt the eyes of other passengers on her now, their curiosity turning to skepticism. The cabin suddenly felt suffocating, and Sophia quickly excused herself, retreating to the galley. Dennis watched her retreat, shaking his head slightly. He could see the cracks forming and knew it was only a matter of time before they widened. Whatever Sophia had done, it was clear that it wasn't going to blow over quietly. And if his instincts were right, the passenger she had crossed wasn't just anyone. Back in the main cabin, Olivia reached for her notebook again. She wrote a single line in bold, deliberate handwriting. "Moments define change." Then, closing the notebook, she leaned back in her seat, the faintest hint of a smile on her lips. The pieces were in place, and soon, the ripple effects of Sophia's actions would become impossible to ignore. Sophia paced the galley, her heart racing and her thoughts spinning out of control. The businessman's pointed question replayed in her mind, each word sharpening the realization that her actions weren't being brushed aside. The captain's call, Dennis's subtle warnings, and now the unease among the passengers. It was all building up, and she couldn't ignore it anymore. For the first time, Sophia felt the fragile foundation of her authority slipping away, replaced by an unfamiliar sense of dread. Dennis, standing nearby, watched her closely. He didn't say anything at first, letting her pace and fumble with trays and cups. But when she dropped a cup of water onto the galley counter, he finally broke the silence. "Sophia," he said, his voice calm but firm, "you need to tell me what's really going on. If there's a problem, you'd better face it now because it's not going to disappear on its own." She shot him a sharp glance, her defensiveness kicking in again. "I already told you, Dennis, it was a ticket issue. I handled it." Dennis crossed his arms, his expression skeptical. "You handled it?" he repeated. "If by handled it, you mean moving a paying first-class passenger to economy without a valid reason, then yeah, you handled it all right. But that's not going to fly, pun intended, with the airline. Do you even know who she is?" Sophia stiffened, her defenses faltering. She looked out of place. She admitted reluctantly, her voice dropping to a near whisper. I thought maybe she had gotten the wrong seat." Dennis's expression shifted from skeptical to outright disapproving. He leaned in closer, lowering his voice but not his tone. "You thought she looked out of place? That's your justification? Sophia, do you even hear yourself? This isn't a random traveler we're talking about. Dr. Grant is a high-profile passenger. If you made that decision based on an assumption..." He didn't need to finish the sentence. The weight of what he left unsaid was clear. Sophia's heart sank further. She wanted to argue, to defend herself, but Dennis's words struck too close to the truth she had been avoiding. She had acted on instinct, on a gut feeling that she now realized was nothing more than an unfair bias. And now, she was standing on the brink of facing the full consequences of that decision. Meanwhile, in the economy cabin, Olivia sat with an air of quiet determination. Her phone vibrated again, but this time she didn't need to check the message. She already knew things were unfolding exactly as planned. She looked out the window, her reflection calm but purposeful, her thoughts as steady as her outward appearance. Lila, the empathetic flight attendant, returned to Olivia's row with a soft smile. "Ma'am, can I get you anything else?" she asked, her tone as kind as it had been earlier. Olivia looked up and met her eyes. "Thank you, Lila," she said, her voice warm but measured. "You've been wonderful." There was no need to say more. The gratitude in Olivia's tone was genuine, and Lila felt it. As Lila moved on, Olivia glanced across the aisle where a fellow passenger, a middle-aged woman with a curious expression, leaned in slightly. "I couldn't help but notice what happened earlier," the woman said in a hushed tone. "That flight attendant. She seemed out of line. Are you all right?" Olivia offered a polite smile, her voice calm. "I'm fine, thank you. Sometimes people make mistakes, and it's important to address them appropriately." The woman nodded, her curiosity still evident but tempered by Olivia's composed demeanor. Around them, A few passengers exchanged quiet glances, their whispers carrying subtle traces of sympathy and intrigue. Olivia noticed, but she didn't react. She wasn't here to gather support or make a scene. Her focus remained on the larger picture. In the first-class cabin, however, the tension had reached a breaking point. The murmurs among passengers had grown louder, and Dennis was now the recipient of more than one concerned inquiry. "What's going on with that passenger who was moved?" asked another businessman, his tone curious but firm. Dennis responded diplomatically, brushing off the questions with vague reassurances, but even he could feel the weight of the situation escalating. The intercom buzzed, and the captain's voice came through again. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We'd like to remind you that all passengers should remain seated unless necessary. Our crew is here to ensure your comfort, so please don't hesitate to ask if you need anything." The routine announcement did little to calm Sophia's nerves. She felt like the walls of the plane were closing in on her, each passing moment amplifying her fear. She knew she needed to prepare for whatever awaited her upon landing, but the uncertainty of it all left her paralyzed. Olivia, on the other hand, leaned back in her seat, her expression unreadable. She glanced briefly at her watch before closing her eyes for a moment. The quiet confidence she exuded was a stark contrast to the growing chaos behind the scenes. While Sophia wrestled with the fallout of her actions, Olivia was already one step ahead, fully aware that the tide was turning. The hum of the airplane engines filled the cabin as the tension in the first-class section reached a near breaking point. Sophia found herself unable to focus on her tasks, her thoughts clouded with fear and regret. She felt the weight of every glance from Dennis, the passengers, and even her own reflection in the glossy galley cabinets. For someone who had always prided herself on maintaining control, the feeling of powerlessness was suffocating. Dennis stepped closer, lowering his voice to ensure their conversation remained private. "Sophia," he said firmly, "you need to tell the truth when we land. If you don't own up to this, it's only going to get worse. The airline doesn't play games with first-class complaints, especially ones that could hint at discrimination." Sophia's chest tightened at the word. Discrimination was the last accusation she wanted to face, but Dennis's warning made it impossible to ignore. She turned to him, her voice shaky. "I wasn't trying to, discriminate. I just thought she didn't..." "Didn't what?" Dennis interrupted, his expression a mix of frustration and disappointment. "Didn't look the part? Didn't fit the profile of a first-class passenger? Do you even hear how that sounds, Sophia?" She froze, unable to respond. Dennis had put into words the exact thought she had been trying to suppress. She felt her stomach churn, the reality of her actions crashing over her like a wave. But before she could process it further, the phone in the galley buzzed again. Sophia hesitated before answering. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted the receiver. "This is Sophia," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "This is the captain again." The voice on the other end began, calm but laced with authority. "We've received another call from the executive office. They're requesting that Dr. Olivia Grant be given priority service for the remainder of the flight. Additionally, they've asked for a preliminary explanation of why she was removed from first class. You'll need to document everything as soon as we land." Sophia's face went pale. "Yes, Captain," she managed to reply, her voice barely above a whisper. She hung up the phone and leaned against the counter, her breath shallow. The words, executive office and priority service echoed in her mind. It was becoming clear that Dr. Grant wasn't just another passenger. She was someone with significant influence. And now, Sophia's actions were under scrutiny at the highest level. Meanwhile, in the economy cabin, Olivia remained composed, though she was well aware of the shift happening on the flight. Her phone buzzed again, and this time she read the message. Senior team alerted. Response in progress. She slipped the phone back into her bag, her expression calm but resolute. This wasn't about revenge for her. It was about accountability. Olivia had spent her entire career advocating for fairness and respect, and she wasn't about to let an incident like this go unchecked. Lila approached Olivia again, this time with an air of caution. "Ma'am, I just wanted to check in and make sure everything is okay. If there's anything I can do to make you more comfortable, please let me know." Olivia looked up and gave Lila a small, warm smile. "Thank you, Lila. You've been very kind. I appreciate it." Lila hesitated, then leaned in slightly. "If I may," she said softly, "I saw what happened earlier. I just want you to know that I'm sorry if you felt disrespected. I know that's not my place, but—" Her voice trailed off, her genuine concern evident. Olivia's smile deepened. "Thank you," she said again, her voice calm but firm. "Your professionalism speaks volumes. It's not your responsibility to fix what others have broken, but your kindness hasn't gone unnoticed." Lila flushed slightly, clearly moved by the compliment, before nodding and stepping away. Olivia made a mental note to highlight Lila's actions when the time came to share her account of the incident. In the first-class section, Sophia was unraveling. She busied herself with pouring drinks and checking on passengers, but her movements were stiff, and her usual composure was gone. The whispers from earlier had grown louder, and now several passengers were openly discussing what had happened. "She had a valid ticket, didn't she?" one man asked the passenger beside him, his tone incredulous. "I think so," the other replied. "I mean, she showed her boarding pass. It doesn't make sense." Sophia tried to ignore the murmurs, but they felt deafening. She turned toward Dennis, hoping for some form of reassurance, but his expression was stony. "I told you this wouldn't end well," he said quietly. "You'd better hope she's feeling forgiving, because right now it doesn't look good." Sophia's chest tightened further. She felt trapped, unsure of how to navigate the mess she had created. The minutes dragged on, each one amplifying her anxiety. Meanwhile, Olivia's calm demeanor remained intact as she glanced at her watch. She had been patient, but she also knew when to act. She picked up her notebook again, writing a single line before closing it. "Respect is earned, not demanded." She then slid the notebook back into her bag and adjusted her posture, preparing for the next phase of the situation. The plane continued its steady flight, but the atmosphere inside was anything but calm. The power dynamic was shifting rapidly, and Olivia knew it was only a matter of time before the consequences of Sophia's actions became unavoidable. For now, though, she remained composed, fully aware of the storm that was about to break. The tension on the flight reached an almost unbearable level as the plane continued its journey. In the first-class cabin, Sophia's nerves were visibly fraying. Each time she passed through the aisles, she felt the weight of the passengers' curious and judgmental gazes. Her usual confidence had been replaced by a rigid stiffness, and even the most mundane tasks, like pouring drinks or adjusting a passenger's tray table, felt like monumental efforts. Dennis kept a close eye on her, his face a mask of disapproval. He knew Sophia had made a serious misstep, and while he wanted to stay neutral, her lack of acknowledgement or accountability made it impossible. As he prepared the next round of refreshments, he finally broke the silence between them. "Sophia," he said flatly, "you've been doing this job long enough to know better. You need to get ahead of this before it spirals even more out of control." Sophia bristled, turning toward him with a defensive glare. "And what am I supposed to do, Dennis? March back there and beg her forgiveness?" she snapped, her voice low but sharp. Dennis shook his head slowly. "You can't undo what you've already done, but you can take responsibility. Sitting here pretending everything's fine isn't going to save you." Sophia looked away, her mind racing. She wanted to believe she had done the right thing, that she had followed her instincts as a professional. But the truth was becoming harder to ignore. Every glance from Dennis, every whisper from the passengers, and every memory of Olivia's calm, unflinching gaze made her question her actions. Deep down, she knew she had let her biases cloud her judgment, and now the consequences were bearing down on her like a storm. In the economy cabin, Olivia remained composed, but her sharp mind continued to work behind the scenes. She had already prepared a detailed account of the incident, including notes about the behavior of each crew member. The airline would have everything they needed to take action, and Olivia was determined to ensure they did. Her phone buzzed again, and she checked the screen discreetly. The message read, "Footage reviewed." all details logged, awaiting further instructions. Olivia nodded slightly to herself, a small, almost imperceptible movement that only she noticed. She wasn't one to escalate situations unnecessarily, but she had no intention of letting this one slide. The truth was already in motion, and she knew the next steps would come swiftly. Lila, the kind and empathetic flight attendant, returned to Olivia's row, this time looking a little nervous. "Ma'am," she said softly, bending slightly so her voice wouldn't carry. "I've just been informed that the captain would like to apologize personally once we land. I hope that's acceptable?" Olivia's eyes met Lila's, her expression calm but pointed. "That's a good start," she replied evenly. "Thank you for letting me know." Lila nodded and straightened, visibly relieved that Olivia didn't seem angry. As she walked away, Olivia allowed herself a moment to reflect. The apology was a step in the right direction, but it wasn't enough. This wasn't just about her. It was about ensuring that no one else faced the same kind of treatment. She had worked too hard to break barriers and build her reputation to let someone's assumptions reduce her to a stereotype. Back in the first-class cabin, Sophia's unease had reached its peak. She was running out of tasks to keep herself busy, and the minutes seemed to stretch into hours. Just as she began refilling a passenger's drink, the intercom buzzed again. The captain's voice came through, calm but with an undeniable undercurrent of authority. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. As we prepare for our descent, I'd like to thank you again for flying with us. I also want to remind everyone that we're here to ensure your comfort and safety. If there's anything you need, please don't hesitate to let the crew know." The announcement seemed innocuous, but to Sophia, it felt like a thinly veiled reminder of the mess she had created. She glanced toward the galley where Dennis was watching her, his expression unreadable. She couldn't take it anymore. The pressure, the judgment, the uncertainty, it was all too much. "I'm going to check on something," Sophia muttered to Dennis, avoiding his gaze as she hurried away toward the front of the plane. She needed a moment to breathe, to think, to figure out how to salvage the situation. But as she passed through the cabin, she caught sight of Olivia seated calmly in the economy section. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and Sophia felt her stomach drop. There was no anger in Olivia's gaze, no outward sign of hostility. Instead, her expression was calm, almost unnervingly so. It was the kind of calm that spoke volumes without saying a word. It told Sophia that Olivia was in control of the situation, that every move she made had been deliberate, and that she wasn't going to back down. Sophia quickly looked away, her heart pounding in her chest. Meanwhile, Dennis sighed as he continued his work in the galley. He had seen plenty of tough situations during his years with the airline, but this one was different. The tension wasn't just about a simple passenger complaint. It was about something deeper, something more serious. And Dennis knew that when the plane landed, things would come to a head. As the descent began, Olivia looked out the window, watching the cityscape come into view. She adjusted her posture, preparing for what was to come. She had done everything she could to address the situation calmly and professionally, and now it was time to let the truth unfold. She glanced at her watch, then at her bag, where her phone rested silently. Everything was ready. The next move wasn't hers to make. It was the airline's. Sophia, on the other hand, felt the walls closing in. She tried to steady her breathing, forcing herself to focus on the tasks at hand, but the weight of her actions was unbearable. She knew that when the plane touched down, there would be no escape from the consequences of what she had done. And the worst part was, she wasn't sure she was ready to face them. As the plane began its descent, the air inside the cabin felt heavier than the pressurized atmosphere outside. Olivia remained composed in her economy seat, her focus sharp. Around her, passengers began adjusting their seats and stowing away their belongings in preparation for landing. The faint hum of whispered conversations continued, with more passengers noticing the underlying tension between the crew and Olivia. A few exchanged knowing glances, their curiosity about what had unfolded earlier growing stronger with each passing moment. Sophia, stationed near the front of the first-class cabin, was on the verge of unraveling completely. The steady descent of the plane mirrored the sinking feeling in her stomach. Every action she had taken since the start of the flight now seemed to play back in her mind with glaring clarity, each decision amplifying the realization of her mistake. She clutched the edge of the galley counter, her knuckles turning white as she tried to maintain some semblance of composure. Dennis approached her again, his tone quieter this time but no less direct. "Sophia, I don't know what you think is going to happen when we land, but this isn't going away," he said firmly. "You've got to own this. The more you try to brush it off, the worse it's going to get." Sophia shot him a frustrated glance. "And what do you suggest I do, Dennis?" she hissed under her breath. "Admit I made a mistake and let them throw me under the bus?" Dennis leaned in slightly, his expression stern. "This isn't about saving face anymore. This is about accountability. You messed up and you know it. The airline will deal with it. But how you handle yourself right now will make all the difference." Sophia felt the sting of his words but said nothing. She turned away, pretending to focus on the drink cart, but her hands trembled as she poured a glass of sparkling water. Her thoughts raced, trying to piece together a way out of the mess she had created. But deep down, she knew there was no undoing what had already been done. In the economy cabin, Olivia leaned back slightly in her seat, her fingers lightly tapping the armrest. She glanced at her watch again, noting the time. The wheels of accountability were already turning, and she had no intention of interfering with the process. Her actions during the flight had been intentional, calculated, not to seek revenge, but to ensure that justice was served in a manner that was both measured and impactful. As the plane descended through the clouds, the intercom buzzed again, and the captain's voice came through, calm but authoritative. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We will be landing shortly. Please ensure your seat belts are fastened, your tray tables are in their upright positions, and all carry-on items are stowed securely. Cabin crew, prepare for landing." The announcement sent a flurry of activity through the cabin as passengers adjusted their positions and secured their belongings. Olivia took a moment to glance toward the front of the plane, her eyes briefly meeting Dennis's. He gave her a subtle nod, one of acknowledgement and quiet understanding. It was clear to him now who she was, not just a first-class passenger, but someone with significant influence. Dennis wasn't sure what would happen when they landed, but he knew the fallout would be significant. As the plane touched down smoothly on the runway, a collective sigh of relief swept through the cabin. The usual rustling of seatbelts unfastening and bags being retrieved began, but the undercurrent of tension lingered, particularly in the first-class section. Passengers exchanged glances, many of them curious about the earlier events, but hesitant to speak openly. Olivia, however, remained seated, her movements unhurried. She knew better than to rush. She reached into her bag, pulled out her phone and typed a brief message. "Landed. Proceed as discussed." After hitting send, she slipped the phone back into her bag and adjusted her blazer. There was no need to make a scene. Everything was already in motion. Sophia, stationed near the exit door, forced a strained smile as passengers began filing out. Her usual confident demeanor was nowhere to be found. Instead, she felt exposed, vulnerable, and utterly out of control. Each time a passenger passed her, she felt their judgment, even in the polite smiles and nods she received. She couldn't shake the feeling that they knew, that everyone on the plane was aware of what had happened. As Olivia rose from her seat and made her way toward the exit, the few remaining passengers in the cabin turned to watch. Her calm, composed walk carried an air of quiet authority, a stark contrast to the nervous energy radiating from Sophia. When Olivia reached the exit, Sophia forced herself to meet her gaze, her hands trembling slightly as she held a tray with a glass of sparkling water. "Thank you for flying with us, Dr. Grant," Sophia said, her voice faltering. Olivia paused for a moment, her sharp, unwavering eyes meeting Sophia's. There was no malice in her expression, only a calm, measured intensity. "I'm sure this isn't the last we'll be speaking," she said smoothly, her words carrying a weight that sent a chill down Sophia's spine. Without waiting for a reply, Olivia stepped off the plane and into the bustling terminal, her steps steady and purposeful. She wasn't looking back, there was no need. Behind her, the wheels of accountability were already turning, and she knew they wouldn't stop. As Sophia stood frozen near the exit, the hum of the terminal's energy suddenly pierced through the cabin. Her heart sank as two uniformed airline security officers stepped onto the plane, their presence commanding immediate attention. They scanned the cabin before their eyes landed on her. "Are you Sophia Blake?" one of the officers asked, his tone neutral but firm. Sophia's breath hitched. "Yes," she managed to reply, her voice barely audible. "We need you to come with us," the officer said. "There's a matter that requires your immediate attention." Sophia's world seemed to collapse around her as the words hit her like a freight train. She glanced toward Dennis, who stood silently in the galley, his expression unreadable. There was no escape now. Every action she had taken during the flight was coming back to confront her, and the reality was undeniable. The remaining crew exchanged uneasy glances as the officers escorted Sophia off the plane. The passengers who had lingered in the terminal watched the scene unfold, their whispers growing louder. For many, it was just another curiosity in the bustling chaos of the airport. But for Sophia, it was the moment she realized that her actions had real, lasting consequences. Consequences she wasn't prepared to face. Sophia's hands trembled as she walked alongside the airline security officers, her every step echoing the gravity of the situation. The terminal, bustling with its usual mix of hurried travelers and chatter, felt distant, like a blur around her. She wanted to say something, to explain, but the lump in her throat made it impossible. Every instinct told her that she was about to face the consequences of the snap judgment she had made in the air, and no amount of justification would undo the damage. The officers led her to a small, windowless room in the terminal. It was plain and stark, with a simple table and two chairs. Sophia took a seat hesitantly, her heart pounding so loudly she thought the officers could hear it. One of them handed her a clipboard with a standard form, the kind she had seen before but never had to fill out. It was labeled Incident Report. "Please provide a detailed account of your actions during the flight," one officer said, his tone neutral but firm. "The airline's executive office will review this along with other reports to determine the next steps." Sophia swallowed hard, gripping the pen so tightly her knuckles turned white. She stared at the blank form, her mind a chaotic swirl of emotions, fear, regret, and the sinking realization that her career was on the line. How could she explain what she had done without sounding like a villain? How could she justify acting on a gut feeling that, in hindsight, had been nothing but prejudice? Meanwhile, in the bustling terminal just beyond the security office, Olivia walked calmly toward the baggage claim. She moved with purpose, her every step deliberate. Her phone buzzed again and she glanced at the screen. It was a message from the airline's senior executive team. Formal investigation initiated. All necessary footage and testimonies secured. She typed a brief response. Acknowledged. Ensure full accountability. Olivia reached the carousel just as the first bags began to roll out. She retrieved her sleek black suitcase with ease, her composure unshaken. Around her, a few passengers from the flight stole glances, clearly recognizing her. Some whispered quietly, their curiosity evident, but Olivia paid them no mind. Her focus was on the bigger picture. Back in the small room, Sophia's hand hovered over the form. She had written her name, her flight number, and the date, but the section labeled Incident Description remained glaringly blank. Every word she thought to write felt hollow. How could she explain moving a paying first-class passenger to economy simply because she had decided, in a fleeting moment, that the woman didn't belong there? The door opened, and a senior airline representative stepped in. Dressed in a sharp suit, he carried an air of authority that made Sophia's stomach tighten further. He took a seat across from her, his face unreadable. "Ms. Blake," he began, folding his hands on the table. "I'm here to ensure we have a clear understanding of what happened on this flight. This isn't just about your actions. It's about the airline's reputation and our commitment to fairness. Do you understand the seriousness of this? Sophia nodded weakly, unable to meet his gaze. Yes, sir, she murmured. Good, he continued. Then let's start with the basics. Why did you move, Doctor? Olivia Grant from her assigned first-class seat. Sophia hesitated, her throat dry. She could feel the weight of the representative's gaze, and the silence in the room seemed to stretch endlessly. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I thought there was an error, she said weakly. I didn't think she belonged in first class. The representative raised an eyebrow, his tone growing sharper. You didn't think she belonged? Based on what, Ms. Blake? Her ticket was valid. Her behavior was professional. What exactly led you to that conclusion? Sophia's face burned with humiliation. She wanted to defend herself, to claim she had been following protocol, but the truth was unavoidable. She had made an assumption, a biased, unfounded assumption, that had spiraled into an incident she could no longer control. It was a mistake, she admitted finally, her voice cracking. I wasn't thinking clearly. The representative leaned back slightly, his expression still unreadable. A mistake, he repeated. Ms. Blake, this isn't just a minor error. Dr. Grant is not only a respected passenger, but also someone with significant connections to the airline. Her complaint has reached the highest levels of our organization. This isn't something we can sweep under the rug. Sophia's heart sank further. The full weight of her actions and their implications pressed down on her. She knew there was no escaping this, no quick fix to undo the damage. She nodded silently, tears threatening to well in her eyes. Meanwhile, Olivia's phone buzzed again as she stepped into her waiting car outside the terminal. The message was brief, but satisfying. Ms. Blake has been removed from active duty pending a formal review. Sensitivity training and policy reforms to be announced. She set her phone down and allowed herself a brief moment of reflection. This wasn't about punishment. It never had been. It was about creating accountability and ensuring that no one else faced the same kind of treatment. Olivia's goal had always been systemic change, and now, with the wheels set in motion, she felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. Inside the security office, Sophia's session dragged on as the airline representative asked more probing questions. Every answer she gave felt more damning than the last, her flimsy justifications crumbling under scrutiny. By the time she finished her report, her hands were trembling, and her mind was racing with the realization of what she had lost. Thank you, Ms. Blake, the representative said as he stood. We'll be in touch regarding the outcome of this investigation. In the meantime, you are suspended from duty. Sophia barely managed to nod, her vision blurred with unshed tears. As she was escorted out of the room, the whispers and curious glances of passing travelers in the terminal felt like a spotlight shining directly on her. Her uniform, once a symbol of pride, now felt like a scarlet letter. She had spent years building her career, only to watch it unravel in a single day. Olivia's car pulled smoothly into the flow of traffic, leaving the chaos of the airport behind. She glanced out the window, her mind already focused on the next steps. The day's events had been draining, but they had also set the stage for something bigger than her personal experience. Accountability was only the beginning. Real change required persistence, and Olivia had no intention of stopping now. As the car moved toward the city, she felt a quiet determination settle over her. The sky stretched endlessly before her, a fitting reminder of the work that still lay ahead. Sophia sat in her car in the parking lot outside the airport, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Her breathing was uneven, and her thoughts were an endless loop of regret and shame. She replayed every moment of the flight, from the first glance she had given Olivia to the strained apology she had stammered at the end. For years, she had prided herself on being professional, efficient, and respected among her peers. But today, in a matter of hours, she had managed to destroy all of that. Her phone buzzed on the passenger seat. The notification on the screen made her heart sink further. It was an email from the airline's Human Resources Department. She hesitated before opening it, dreading what she knew it would contain. The message was short and formal. You are required to attend a disciplinary hearing tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Failure to comply may result in further action. Details to follow. Sophia felt the tears she had been holding back finally spill over. She wiped at them quickly, frustration bubbling beneath her humiliation. This wasn't just a bad day at work. This was the unraveling of everything she had built. Her uniform, which she had once worn with pride, now felt like a weight dragging her down. The realization that her actions had been rooted in bias she had refused to acknowledge, cut deeper than she expected. She thought about Dennis's words, about how she had acted on assumptions rather than facts, and the regret twisted in her chest like a knife. Meanwhile, across the city, Olivia sat in her office, reviewing the latest updates from the airline's executive team. The email outlined the initial steps being taken: Sophia's suspension, a formal investigation into the incident, and plans to expedite news sensitivity training for all airline staff. Attached was a draft of a public statement the airline planned to release, apologizing for the incident and committing to systemic reforms. Olivia read the draft carefully, her expression thoughtful. It was a good start, but she wasn't ready to settle for half measures. She picked up her phone and dialed a number. After a few rings, a familiar voice answered. "Dr. Grant," came the voice of Richard Hale, the airline's CEO. His tone was professional but carried a distinct note of unease. "Thank you for taking the time to speak with me. I wanted to personally apologize for what you experienced on your flight. I assure you, we're treating this matter with the utmost seriousness." "I appreciate that, Mr. Hale," Olivia replied evenly. "But apologies alone won't fix this. This incident isn't just about me. It's about the culture that allowed this to happen in the first place. If your team is truly committed to change, then we need more than a statement." "Of course," Hale said quickly. "We're already implementing mandatory sensitivity and bias training for all employees, and we'll be revising our internal protocols to ensure situations like this are addressed properly in the future." "That's a start," Olivia said, her tone measured. "But I want transparency. I expect regular updates on the progress of these initiatives, and I'd like to review the training materials before they're implemented. This can't just be about optics, Mr. Hale. It has to be real, lasting change." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "Understood," Hale finally said. "We'll provide you with everything you need. Your input will be invaluable in shaping these reforms." Olivia ended the call, leaning back in her chair. She wasn't naive. She knew the airline's actions were as much about protecting their reputation as they were about addressing the root of the problem. But if her influence could push them toward genuine change, she was willing to use it. At that same moment, Sophia was driving home, the reality of her situation pressing down on her with every mile. Her mind raced with questions she couldn't answer. How had she let this happen? Why hadn't she thought twice before making that decision? And, more importantly, what would she do now? By the time she pulled into her driveway, the weight of the day had become unbearable. She sat in her car for several minutes, staring blankly at the dashboard. She had no one to blame but herself, and that realization was harder to swallow than any disciplinary action the airline could impose. She finally stepped out of the car and walked into her small apartment, the silence inside almost deafening. Her phone buzzed again and she hesitated before picking it up. This time it was a message from a close friend who worked at the airline. "I heard what happened. I'm so sorry. Let me know if you need anything." Sophia stared at the message for a long moment before typing a simple reply. "Thanks. I don't know what to do." The next morning, as the city came alive with the sounds of a new day, Olivia prepared for her meeting with the airline's board. She dressed in a crisp, tailored suit, her mind focused and her notes organized. This wasn't just a meeting, it was an opportunity to push for the systemic change she had been advocating for her entire career. At the same time, Sophia sat in a sterile conference room at the airline's headquarters, waiting for her disciplinary hearing to begin. The minutes ticked by, each one stretching longer than the last. When the door finally opened, 3 senior executives walked in, their expressions neutral but firm. Sophia's heart sank as she realized this was it, the moment she would have to face the full consequences of her actions. "Ms. Blake," one of the executives began, her voice calm but authoritative. "Thank you for coming. We're here to discuss the incident on Flight 784 and your role in what transpired. This is a formal disciplinary hearing, and we expect full transparency in your account of the events." Sophia nodded weakly, her throat dry. "I understand," she said, though her voice barely rose above a whisper. As the executives began questioning her, Sophia struggled to find the right words. She knew the facts were against her, and every attempt to explain her actions only made them sound worse. By the time the hearing ended, Sophia felt utterly defeated. The final decision would be communicated to her later, but in her heart, she already knew the outcome. While Sophia faced her reckoning, Olivia sat across from the airline's board members, outlining her expectations for the reforms. Her voice was calm but firm, her presence commanding. She wasn't just advocating for herself, she was fighting for every passenger who had ever been dismissed, disrespected, or judged unfairly. And the board, recognizing the weight of her words, listened intently. As Olivia left the meeting, she felt a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in a long time. Change wasn't guaranteed, but she had planted the seeds. And as she stepped out into the crisp morning air, she knew this was only the beginning. The day of reckoning arrived for Sophia as the airline's disciplinary committee convened to deliver their decision. She sat in the same stark conference room where she had given her account days earlier. This time she was alone. The panel of executives who had questioned her entered the room one by one, their expressions neutral, but carrying an air of finality. Each carried a folder filled with documents, testimonies, reports, and evidence from the incident. Sophia's chest tightened as she realized that every detail of her mistake had been carefully dissected and evaluated. "Ms. Blake," began the senior executive, a woman with sharp features and a no-nonsense tone. "After reviewing the evidence, including passenger testimonies, security footage, and your own statement, we have reached a decision regarding your actions on Flight 784. Sophia swallowed hard, her palms damp against the table. She braced herself, knowing there was no way to undo what had already been set in motion. "Your actions not only violated company policy, but also jeopardized the airline's reputation," the executive continued. "While we acknowledge that mistakes can happen, your decision to act on assumptions rather than verifiable facts constitutes a serious breach of our standards for professionalism and fairness." The words felt like a hammer blow, each one driving home the reality of what Sophia had done. She wanted to argue, to plead her case, but the logical part of her knew there was nothing left to say. She had crossed a line, and the consequences were inevitable. "Effective immediately, you are terminated from your position with the airline," the executive announced, her tone resolute. "You will receive further instructions on your severance and the handling of any remaining obligations via email. We recommend that you use this experience to reflect and, if possible, grow from the mistakes made here today." Sophia's breath caught in her throat, and she felt the sting of tears threatening to spill. She had spent years building her career, climbing through the ranks of the airline industry, only to lose it all in a single moment of poor judgment. She nodded silently, unable to trust her voice to respond. As the executives exited the room, one of them paused briefly at the door. It was Dennis, who had been invited to provide testimony during the review process. He didn't say anything at first, his expression unreadable. But then he gave her a small somber nod, a gesture that felt more like pity than sympathy. Then he was gone, leaving Sophia alone with the crushing weight of her actions. Meanwhile, Olivia's day unfolded in stark contrast. She sat in her office reviewing a series of emails from the airline's executive team. Each message detailed the immediate reforms being implemented: mandatory sensitivity training for all staff, a complete overhaul of the complaint and escalation process, and the establishment of a new advisory committee to monitor fairness and accountability within the company. It was more progress than Olivia had anticipated, and she allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. One email in particular caught her attention. It was a forwarded message from the CEO, Richard Hale, sharing the outcome of Sophia's disciplinary hearing. Olivia read it carefully, her expression thoughtful. She wasn't vindictive by nature, and while she knew Sophia's dismissal was warranted, it didn't bring her joy. What mattered to Olivia was the larger change, the policies and practices that would prevent incidents like this from happening again. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from Maya, her assistant. "The airline has issued their public statement. I thought you'd want to see it." Olivia clicked the link Maya had included, which directed her to a press release on the airline's official website. The statement began with a clear acknowledgement of the incident. "We deeply regret the events that occurred on Flight 784, in which one of our valued passengers, Dr. Olivia Grant, experienced unacceptable treatment. This incident has highlighted areas where we must do better, and we are committed to making meaningful changes to ensure that all passengers are treated with dignity and respect." The statement went on to outline the specific reforms the airline was implementing, including the changes Olivia had pushed for during her discussions with the board. As she read, Olivia felt a sense of validation, not for herself, but for everyone who had ever faced the kind of bias she had endured. This wasn't just her victory, it was a step forward for passengers, employees, and the airline itself. Later that evening, as Olivia prepared to leave her office, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was an unexpected email from Sophia. Olivia hesitated for a moment before opening it. The message began with a simple acknowledgement of the events that had unfolded. "Dr. Grant, I owe you an apology. My actions on that flight were inexcusable, and I want to take full responsibility for the way I treated you. I acted on assumptions rather than facts, and I allowed my biases to dictate my behavior. I am deeply sorry for the disrespect I showed you, and I want you to know that I am committed to learning from this experience." Sophia's words were raw and genuine, carrying a vulnerability that Olivia hadn't expected. The email continued, with Sophia explaining how the aftermath of the incident had forced her to confront her own prejudices and shortcomings. She expressed a desire to grow from the experience and to use it as a catalyst for change in her own life. Olivia read the email carefully, noting the tone of sincerity. While she remained cautious about accepting apologies at face value, she also understood the importance of accountability and growth. After a moment of thought, she typed a brief response. "Ms. Blake, thank you for your message. Accountability is the first step toward growth, and I hope you continue to reflect and learn from this experience. I believe in the possibility of change, and I hope you use this opportunity to contribute positively in the future." As Olivia hit send, she leaned back in her chair, her mind calm but focused. The events of the past week had been draining, but they had also been necessary. The fight for fairness and accountability was far from over, but Olivia knew she had made an impact, and that, for now, was enough. At the same time, Sophia sat in her apartment staring at Olivia's response. The words weren't overly forgiving, nor were they dismissive. They were a reminder that growth was possible, but only if she took the lessons to heart. For the first time in days, Sophia felt a faint glimmer of hope, not for her career, but for the person she still had a chance to become. Weeks passed, and the ripple effects of the incident on Flight 784 began to take hold. The airline had rolled out its first sensitivity and bias training sessions for employees, a move that garnered both praise and scrutiny from industry professionals and the public alike. The story of Dr. Olivia Grant and her treatment during the flight had made waves across social media and news outlets, sparking broader conversations about discrimination in professional environments. Olivia watched the developments from a distance, choosing to stay out of the public discourse beyond her initial role in pushing for accountability. She had always believed in leading through action, not spectacle, and the progress the airline was making spoke louder than any statement she could give. Yet, her quiet influence continued to shape the reforms. She received regular updates from the advisory committee, outlining measurable improvements in employee attitudes and customer service. It was a small but significant victory, one that reminded Olivia why she had refused to let the incident slide. One day, while preparing for a meeting at her office, Olivia received a surprising email from Lila, the empathetic flight attendant who had shown her kindness during the ordeal. Lila wrote about how the incident had inspired her to approach her job with even more compassion and mindfulness. She shared that she had been promoted to a senior role within the airline, a recognition of her professionalism during a difficult situation. Olivia smiled as she read the email. She quickly replied, congratulating Lila and thanking her for the warmth and respect she had shown. It was a reminder that even in challenging moments, there were people who stood out for their humanity and integrity. Meanwhile, Sophia's life had taken a vastly different turn. Her dismissal from the airline had left her reeling, but it also forced her to confront her biases and actions in a way she never had before. Determined not to let the experience define her entirely, she sought out opportunities to educate herself and rebuild. She joined a nonprofit organization focused on workplace diversity and inclusion, initially as a volunteer. Over time, her contributions grew, and she began sharing her story, not to gain sympathy, but to highlight the importance of accountability and the dangers of unchecked assumptions. Sophia's journey wasn't easy, and it was far from over. She faced skepticism from those who doubted her sincerity, but she chose to focus on the work rather than the criticism. Each day was a step toward becoming the person she had once thought herself to be, only now, with a deeper understanding of the values she wanted to uphold. One afternoon, as Olivia was heading through the airport for yet another flight, she noticed the subtle changes that had begun to take root. The staff at the check-in counters greeted passengers warmly. Flight attendants moved through the boarding lines with patience, and the overall energy felt different, more intentional. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. As she approached the gate, the agent recognized her and offered an upgrade to first class. Olivia smiled and declined politely, preferring to sit where she had been assigned. She appreciated the gesture, but for her, the fight had never been about personal gain. It was about creating a space where fairness and dignity were non-negotiable. As the plane took off, Olivia leaned back in her seat, gazing out at the clouds stretching endlessly into the horizon. The events of Flight 784 had been a turning point, not just for her, but for many others. It was a reminder that change didn't happen overnight, nor did it come without resistance. But with persistence and the courage to speak up, progress was possible. Somewhere else in the city, Sophia sat at her desk at the nonprofit, drafting an outreach proposal. Her new role wasn't glamorous, and it didn't come with the prestige she had once enjoyed, but it felt meaningful. Each day was a chance to contribute to something larger than herself, to reshape the systems that had allowed her own biases to flourish. She thought often about Olivia's calm strength and the way she had handled the situation, not with anger, but with purpose. It was a model Sophia hoped to emulate in her own life. For both women, the journey wasn't over, but as the wheels of accountability continued to turn, their stories served as a reminder of what could happen when people chose to confront injustice with determination and grace. In the end, the sky wasn't the limit, it was just the beginning. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button, share your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. See you in the next one.